laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast with your host, Will Nesbitt.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast, the podcast where I investigate and expose ongoing, unlawful, non-consensual human experimentation on innocent men and women in the U.S. and possibly abroad. I am one of those people victimized by this atrocity, and now I am working hard to restore justice by sharing evidence and information in hopes of prompting a proper investigation. Join me in my fight and help raise awareness by tuning in and sharing this podcast with your family and friends.
Of the American people that this could have happened, and the only way that the healing process, not only for your families but for our country, can take place is if we make sure that everyone who was wronged is given proper compensation. Ms. Welsome, tell us about the most horrible elements, in your opinion, of what you found that took place in these experiments over the years.
I thought as I researched the story, it just grew more and more horrific. And then as I met the family members, I was even more appalled because they were people like you and me. And as I learned more about the patients, they were just ordinary Americans. And the one story I would like to relate, because he's not here, he's dead, he died in 1966, is the story of Albert Stevens. He was a California house painter in Healdsburg. He was injected with a quote-unquote so-called massive lethal textbook dose of plutonium in 1945 at the University of California Hospital in San Francisco. He was diagnosed a very clear misdiagnosis with stomach cancer. He actually had a very bad ulcer. On the operating table, while he was unconscious, a number of his organs and body tissue were removed, including his spleen, part of his liver, his ninth rib, an apron of fat covering some of the internal organs, part of the stomach, etc. Some of the stomach and I believe some of the lymph nodes went to the pathology department, where the pathologists then determined that in fact he didn't have stomach cancer, that he had an ulcer. But the rest of his organs in his blood show up in a formerly secret report entitled "The Comparison of the Metabolism of Plutonium in Man and the Rat." These organs were analyzed for their plutonium content. As best I can tell, the rib, for example, was scraped. The outer cells were scraped. It was split down the middle. The marrow was removed. The separate portions of the bone were then analyzed to determine where the plutonium had gone. This gentleman was followed for a year. Doctors from UCSF came up picked up his urine and stool samples in Healdsburg. His family thought that this was all part of his good medical care. This gentleman, after a few years, I'm told by his family, couldn't work any longer. He was too weak. And he died in about 1966. 6 or 7 years after that, Argonne National Laboratory, Center for Human Radiobiology, picked up his cremated remains from Santa Rosa Funeral Home and took him to Argonne, where they put his remains under a microscope. And there they found the plutonium that had survived the ashes of the cremation furnace. And they subsequently did their papers on that, along with papers on what they found in the bones of other patients. Well, I tried to find out where those ashes were for the family, and I called Argonne. Nobody knows where those ashes are. A small portion of his remains are in a radioactive museum-type structure up in Spokane, Washington, along with some remains or tissue samples of 3 of the other patients. And that particular repository is used for scientists who want to study the metabolic effects of plutonium on the human body. So what you have here, and I've said it before, is a case where a man was, in my opinion, horribly abused during his life. And even after death, he was continued to be used. And his family right now, frankly, don't quite know what to do about his remains. What do you do with them? They're radioactive. And that's one of the questions that they're struggling to deal with, how to get the proper burial for their father.
So they have yet to, actually have the ashes returned to them.
It's my understanding they're still at this radioactive repository up in the state of Washington.
And what is the legal justification which the government is giving for their reluctance to return the ashes to the family?
It's unclear to me at this point that when the ashes were shipped in the 70s to Argonne National Laboratory, the daughter signed a permission form saying that she was releasing the ashes for scientific research. I do not know whether this repository is using that release form for continuing to hold the ashes or not. I don't know that answer yet.
Well, it's wrong, just plain wrong, that family or any of the other families are abused in such a way by the federal government. And we'll have to make sure as well that they get all the information which they need, including the remains of their loved one, returned to them.
Another episode of the Devil in the Details podcast. I am your host, Will Nesbitt. Thank you for joining me again. Let's get into it. Today's episode is going to be another good one. I guess I say that about all my episodes, but today is a good one because I have a special guest returning to the podcast. And they did such a great job the last time, I had to have her back on to give us a little bit more. So today's guest is no other than Pulitzer Prize-winning author Eileen Welsome. Now, a little bit about Eileen. She's an investigative reporter and author who has received many national awards for her work, including the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. Her first book, The Plutonium Files, America's Secret Medical Experiments in the Cold War, was published in 1999 and is in the process of being republished. She is also the author of The General and the Jaguar, Pershing's Hunt for Pancho Villa, and Cold War Secrets, A Vanished Professor, a Suspected Killer in Hoover's FBI. She received a master's degree in oral history in 2020 from Columbia University and currently lives in Denver, Colorado. Now, without further delay, I want to bring on our guest, Miss Eileen Welsome. Miss Welsome, how are you today? I'm doing just fine. Thank you for asking. Now, in the intro, I mentioned that your book, The Plutonium Files, was about to be republished when, in fact, it has already been republished. Is that right?
Yes. It was republished, I guess now last fall. So fall of 2024.
Have there been any revisions or anything added or taken away, or is it just kind of like a re-push of the material that you have?
The new book includes a new introduction, and that introduction centers around the Trinity test, the very first bomb test in New Mexico, and it talks about all the people that live down there that are still trying to get justice and compensation for diseases caused by that bomb that has gone through the generations. There's very few people. There are people still alive that were alive when that bomb was detonated, but very few of them. So what's been happening in the last few years, there's been a lot of scrutiny on that test, and what they discovered was the explosion was much bigger than what was historically reported, and that many pounds of plutonium that were released in that detonation were, the plutonium was not detonated. It did not fission. So it spread a plume of radioactive debris across the state in west to east direction. And there were many people that lived out there that had farms, that had ranches. They grew their own food. They had gardens, animals, and this debris got in their water system. It got in their food. It landed on them, and many of them developed thyroid cancer from exposure to this disease, and now, like third generation, have thyroid cancer.
That is terrifying.
It is terrifying, and the fact that I don't know how long has that been now. That even though the new evidence confirms what everybody thought down there, they still have not been compensated. And these are people that have basically been bankrupted by their medical illnesses. They've had to travel long distances to get care and to get specialized care. And the government still doesn't recognize that. They're still fighting for it. There's they do have a website, and people can go and read their stories online.
Now, Eileen, for those who may have missed the last episode that you were with us, tell us about yourself and tell us a little bit more about your book, The Plutonium Files.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. So I was trained as a journalist, and I was working in Albuquerque, New Mexico at an afternoon newspaper called the Albuquerque Tribune. And I came across a reference to an experiment that had been done using humans. And it was a footnote in a document that was connected to some radioactive waste dumps that they had in Albuquerque. So my initial question was, why are these dumps radioactive, and what happened to the animals in them? And in pursuing that initial question is when I came across this experiment involving human beings. So I continued to work as a reporter. I covered all kinds of beats, City Hall, courthouse. I did various investigations, and in my off time, when I was done working for the day, I would stay in the newsroom and work on this story. And the basic question was, I eventually learned that yes, indeed, there was an experiment in which human beings were injected with plutonium during the Manhattan Project, but all of these people had code numbers. And so the problem became, how do you find 18 people with code numbers, no names, in a country of 300 million people? So that was a very difficult endeavor. And I didn't think that I would ever be able to identify one of these people. But I kept working on this project, and as I worked on it, I would file a Freedom of Information Act request with the federal government, as well as go to the scientific literature, the open literature, and try to find information there. Eventually, I got out of my notebook 18 yellow sheets of paper, and I put the code names for these people at the top of each sheet. And as I began to get more information on these individuals, I would put that data beneath the code number. So I eventually learned when they were injected, where they were injected, how old they were, if there was a biopsy done, if their bodies had been exhumed, what kind of disease they were suffering from, and the amount of plutonium injected in their bodies. But still, this was code numbers. So without going into all the details, eventually I was able to identify 4 or 5 people, real people. So once I had their names, the question then became, where do these people live, and are they still alive? And what I discovered was that all of them were dead. So then the next issue was, did they have any relatives? Who were they? Where did they live? And could I find them, and would they talk to me? So it was a very, very long process. And the book, as you asked me initially, is based upon, or grew out of this experiment. But it includes the historical background that led to this experiment, why the government did this experiment, and it went on to describe many other experiments done during the Cold War by either civilian or military scientists. So it covered a 50-year era.
There are a lot of very interesting yet sad stories about the different experiments that you've researched. One of those is the Vanderbilt experiment. Can you tell us about that?
I would be more than happy to. So after my initial series was published in the Albuquerque Tribune, it sort of created a furor. And there were people all over the country, reporters, that began digging up similar experiments in their hometown. And the Vanderbilt women, the case of the Vanderbilt women, was one of them. And these were 800 pregnant women in their first trimester who went to a clinic at Vanderbilt University for checkups. And while they were there for their checkups, they were given quote-unquote cocktails. And these cocktails contain varying doses of highly radioactive iron that was made in a reactor in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. These women drank these cocktails. They never knew what they were given, and they went on to live their lives. Many of them had reactions to these cocktails, including all kinds of blood diseases, skin cancers, anemias, and 4 or 5 of these children died of cancers caused by this radioactive iodine. And one of the mothers was a woman named Emma Kraft. And she had a young daughter named Carolyn, and she was young, 5 years old maybe, when she developed a fast-growing cancer in her body, and it spread all through her body. She was eventually in a wheelchair, and she died. And Emma was never told why her daughter died or that she was ever given this radioactive iodine. And it was similar to the plutonium experiment in that it was a 2-part experiment. There was the original experiment done in the late 40s when the women were given the radioactive cocktails, and then there was a follow-up study done in the 60s by scientists who were investigating the effects of low-level radiation on fetuses. So this second generation of scientists then dug up the old records from Vanderbilt University, sent out questionnaires, and they were the ones who determined that a handful of these young children died from diseases that they attributed to the radioactive cocktails that their mothers were given, and they still did not contact the mothers and inform them of the original injections or the follow-up studies. So most of them, all of them, I should say, that did not find out about this until the mid-90s. And there was a class action lawsuit filed by the mothers that could be found against Vanderbilt University and other parties, and they eventually settled out of court. But it was a really tragic story.
When I hear about these experiments and you look at the people that they do this to, and you it's hard to wrap your mind around doing this to a pregnant mother, to anybody really, but to children and women who are pregnant. It's just it's so low. How can you go through with it and be okay with it?
That's a really good question, and I struggled with that when I was writing this book, And I had the same thoughts. And, there were a few scientists who were still alive, who were either peers or directly involved in these experiments. And they were very defensive and said that what they gained was important information for the good of society. And they argued that the doses of radiation or radioactive materials that were given to these individuals was slight and would not have harmed them. So there was an element of denial in these experiments, denial on the part of the scientists. There was also this patriotic fervor, if you will. I mean, many of them were young. They were maybe starting their careers or in the middle of their careers during World War II. And then the bomb was dropped on Japan, and they knew that nuclear weapons were going to be part of everyday life. And they felt like they needed to get the information that they could to protect society and defend ourselves against communists, i.e., the former Soviet Union. So that, and then there's a more nefarious motive that I have to mention, and that is that these doctor scientists, they were of a different class than most of the people that they experimented on, and they had an attitude of superiority and considered other people, quote unquote, less than they were. So there was that element in play as well. And so they just felt certain people could be sacrificed in the name of science.
And that's unfortunate because, you mentioned how they felt that what they were doing was for the greater good of the country, the government, of the world. But my thing is this: if you felt that this was for the good, the greater good, why wouldn't you test these theories out on the people closest to you? Why wouldn't you test this on your children or yourself or your colleagues or anything like that? Why go for people that you feel are disposable? And of course, that's a rhetorical question, but it's like you knew going in that it was wrong. Now, if there were an experiment where we want to give 20 people $5 million each just to see what would happen, you wouldn't hesitate to use your own people to do that. You're not going to go pick random people from impoverished areas. You're going to choose your own people to do that. So it's just unfortunate.
This is exactly the issue, and that is one of the signs of an ethical experiment is if you are willing to experiment on yourself or your children. And they did not. They reached out to people who, as you say, were quote unquote disposable or who were vulnerable. And what's worse is they did it without their informed consent. And they did these so there was an element of secrecy and cover-up involved in all these experiments. And when they went back to do follow-up studies on the pregnant women, let's say, they never went to them and said, hey, we gave you radioactive iron cocktails in 1947, and we want to see if you or your children had any effects. So there was an element of cover-up. That was what was extraordinary. It wasn't one generation of scientists. It was two generations. So there was this secrecy, if you will, that to me was a corrupting influence during this era, and it allowed for a lot of bad science, a lot of unethical science to take place that the population or the American people never knew about, including the experimental subjects themselves. So, yes, you're right. If you're going to do an experiment, you should do it on yourself or your children or your friends and be upfront about it. And this is one of the questions that go to the findings of a panel that was created by President Clinton or ordered by him. And they found that there were thousands of these so-called radioactive tracer experiments done during the Cold War, but they waved their wand over all of them and said, well, no one was harmed, and that nothing bad was done. And my question was, look, even if you gave someone a dose of radioactive iodine, let's say, and it didn't cause any harm, if it didn't cause any harm, then why didn't you tell them, we're giving you a dose of radioactive iodine? But that is exactly what they didn't do. They didn't tell people. And so that was unethical.
Now, one thing I do want to ask, kind of segue into this, and then I want to ask you about another experiment from your book. In all your research on these experiments, what are some commonalities that you see, especially with the test subjects?
They used in these experiments, I'm going to just group them all together and say the commonality across the board was that these were vulnerable people. These were children. These were fetuses. These were young women. These were people of color. These were impoverished people who were disposable, who didn't ask questions. These were people that these doctor scientists felt free to experiment upon because they knew they could get away with it. Okay?
Right.
That sounds harsh.
It is. It's very harsh.
I mean, if I'm Dr. Welsome, I'm not going to use my own, my colleague isn't going to use my children, because maybe I would say, hey, what are you using this radioactive iron for? Or why are you doing this? So they would pick people that were, as I mentioned, that were vulnerable, that were impoverished, that were, quote, throwaways, that they could just use like they might use Kleenex and toss away.
Whenever I hear about these victims and see that they had to endure what was left of their lives, and in many cases, lives cut short due to something like this. And a lot of times they didn't know until it was too late. Someone had to come and tell them, hey, this is what happened to you. They may have started experiencing some health issues and didn't know what was going on.
Exactly. I remember attending a hearing in Tennessee, and there was a man who spoke before this committee and this Clinton committee, and he was an adult, and he was a fetus when his mother was given this radioactive iron. And he told the committee, he said, what happened was akin to rape. And yeah, it was very intense to hear these mothers speak about their experiment. And I go back to Emma Kraft, who was one of the lead plaintiffs in this case, and whose daughter died of this terrible cancer. And, you know, she said it was quote unquote black cancer, black going all up through her daughter's body. And the symptoms reminded me of what the Chernobyl victims experienced after the meltdown of that reactor in Chernobyl, especially the firemen who went in to fight the fires. And they died, they had gruesome diseases, and died, I mean, their deaths, I mean, death was merciful when it came for them. But they were very unusual forms of cancer. And Emma Kraft talked about her daughter who had the same kind of cancer. So, yes, most of these people who are still alive, and many were already dead, they didn't learn of it until later in life, and they were already suffering from diseases that they didn't understand because, you know, radiation-induced cancers are difficult to separate from cancers that occur in the general population. So no one could say, aha, that was due to the radioactive plutonium or the radioactive iron that so-and-so got. But it certainly, scientists could prove that it induced certain types of cancers in these people who were exposed.
Another experiment that you touch on is at the Cincinnati General Hospital, which I believe is University of Cincinnati Hospital today. Tell us about that particular experiment.
That was a really, really tragic event. And what happened there is this experiment was funded by the military as opposed to the Department of Energy, the Atomic Energy Commission. This was an experiment that was funded by the military. And what they did was they took about 100 vulnerable people that came to that hospital for treatment pre-existing cancers. These were, many of these people, even though they had cancer, it wasn't debilitating. They were living with it. They were going to work. They were going for walks. They were seeing their families. They were eating. They were cooking. They were living their normal lives. And there was a scientist in Cincinnati named Eugene Sanger who headed this experiment. And they exposed to whole body radiation about 95 to 100 people. They exposed them in the basement of Cincinnati Hospital to a machine that exposed their whole body to radiation. And the reason they did this experiment was, remember, it was the Cold War, and they wanted to see what would happen to soldiers on the battlefield. When would they become incapacitated by radiation? So they exposed these civilians, these patients, to radiation. A third of them died within the first 30 days of compressed radiation symptoms. And by that I mean they died of the same kind of symptoms that were seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombs were dropped there. The people developed nausea, they developed vomiting, they developed very low blood count, they developed sepsis, and they died. And so about a third of these people, after they were given this whole body radiation, which I need to point out here, this was not radiation you would normally give for the kind of tumors that these people had. They had hard tumors, such as breast cancer, let's say, that is still used today, but it's focused on one area of the body. This was radiation delivered from sources in this room over their entire body. And it wouldn't have affected their tumors, but it did affect their blood. And so they died, and they died in excruciating agony. And the families grieved, they went on with their lives. And once again, this experiment, there was, some of it was known and reported on, but it sort of it didn't become a really big issue until the mid-90s. And then a lot of these relatives self-identified and got their loved ones' medical records, and it showed the course of their illnesses and their sudden deaths. And one of the people who was very involved in bringing this experiment to light was a professor named Martha Stevens. And she and others identified a lot of these people. And Martha's now in her 80s, and I remember I talked to her a few months ago, and she said, Eileen, she said, I should have brought this case to the district attorney's office because this was murder. This was murder.
That's true. That's exactly what it was.
It's exactly what it was. And the victims in this case were predominantly, there were white people, but the majority of the victims were African Americans.
Yeah, as is the case a lot of times, unfortunately. I've seen a lot of these experiments that, of course, we all know about Tuskegee, and then there's the Pruitt-Igoe apartments, that experiment, so many.
I'm not familiar with the Pruitt-Igoe.
Pruitt-Igoe was a housing project in St. Louis. And what they did was the Army, it was an Army-funded experiment. Initially, they went to a town, and I can't remember exactly where, but I know it was in Missouri. They went to an all-white neighborhood, and what they were doing was spraying the substance at night, kind of like you see different areas that spray for mosquitoes. They drive through town and they spray this fog.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they did the same thing in this town, and the people didn't want it, and they drove them out of there. So they didn't get to do it there, but they went to Pruitt-Igoe housing projects, which was predominantly black, and they sprayed this substance different times of the day, and they even set up these machines on top of the building, and it would spray out at different times of the day. Now, when people asked about it, what they were told was that, and this is ridiculous, they told them that this substance was to help, if the Russians were to attack then this would help to make them invisible. And nobody, I don't know if people really believed it, but nobody really raised a fuss, especially during that time, because this was like maybe during the 60s, 70s. And a lot of times Black people just really, we try to just stay out of the way and do whatever to keep the peace, unless it's something that's extremely violent that we're aware of. But for something like this, people tend to trust the government. And they just let it go. And then years later, when people started having all sorts of health issues, and then it came out that it was actually an experiment they were doing. It was some sort of phosphorus chemical that they were spraying into the air. And it affected a lot of people. As a matter of fact, there are two gentlemen right now who I'd love to talk to that are leading a class action lawsuit concerning that.
That's really interesting. That's tragic.
Yeah. But it just goes to show the depth that they would go to, the lies that they would tell in order to get this done, which completely violates the Belmont report, as well as the Nuremberg Code about informed consent. That's number one. You must get consent. You must let these people know what's happening and make sure that they're fully aware and they're okay with it and that they sign off on it. Because I'm pretty sure, and that's why they do it anyway, because they know if they go to these people and tell them, hey, we're going to inject you with this substance that is more than likely going to kill you, is going to give you this cancer or some other disease, is going to completely destroy your body. Are you okay with this? You know?
Right.
And I also, I had a friend of mine that I talked to, his sister, who was a scientist in Ohio. And I was talking to her a couple of years ago, and she was telling me that one of the issues that they have, like the internal review boards, who are supposed to be keeping tabs on this type of thing, one of the things that they run into is if you do let these patients know what you're doing, you have to pay them. And you have to pay them. And a lot of them avoid paying these people, pocket the cash, and use it for the experiment. So that's another reason why they avoid telling them and avoid getting consent, because you'd have to pay these people up front. In addition to, more than likely, most people will never even go for it in the first place.
Exactly. You know, you touch on one of the elements that's sort of common through all of these experiments, and that is the nature of how duplicitous the scientists, doctors were. And that's another really perplexing question for me was how did they become that way? How did they, what was it in their environment or that allowed them to become so sneaky, to use a kind word? Was it denial? Was it the opportunity for advancement by publishing? I think we can never forget that as an element.
Exactly.
That publish or perish idea.
Exactly.
And that was the only way, a scientist, doctor could advance is by publishing their findings. So the hell with the subjects. Let's just get this into a paper, give the subjects code numbers, and move on. So they had a lot of, as you say, a lot of inducement not to tell people, because if you told people this may have adverse consequences including cancer and or death. Who would agree to that? Now, if you were on your deathbed and you were patriotic, I mean, I think, yes, there are some people who would say, go ahead and use my body for science. But the problem with that is when people are on their deathbed and they are so sick, it's hard for them to do an experiment on them and get the results they're looking for, because these people are so besieged by cancer that what they're looking for is lost in the noise. So they really don't want people who are on their deathbeds. They want people who are generally healthy, right?
Exactly.
That's really an important part of this.
Mm-hmm.
They were looking for people who were generally healthy, that they could get findings on and use in this so-called Cold War, or this war against communism. So, for example, in the case of the plutonium patients, to go back to those individuals who were injected all over the country with varying amounts of plutonium, they wanted people who were relatively healthy because they wanted to get results that could help them understand the metabolism of plutonium and help them in the weapons complex with developing protection standards and so on. But I need to say one more thing about these experiments, and that is they were not only unethical experiments, they were poorly designed experiments. And that's another aspect that a person can look at if they're trying to determine, hey, was I experimented on? Was my loved one experimented on? Was it a well-designed and ethical experiment? And most of these were not. They were haphazard. They were poorly designed. You know, all the plutonium patients, they were different ages. They were suffering from different diseases which affected their metabolism, or they had no diseases at all. So they couldn't develop generalities from 18 people and then apply it to the thousands of workers in the nuclear weapons complex. And the other thing I have to add about the plutonium experiment is that these people were giving a type of plutonium that was soluble in the body. And most people who are exposed to plutonium are exposed to plutonium, a form of plutonium from a detonation. For example, all the detonations at the Nevada test site, or the detonations in the Pacific, or the detonations in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So that's plutonium oxide. These people were given another form of plutonium. So whatever they found out about how it metabolized in the bodies of these 18 people, they could not generalize these findings to the overall population. Another sign of an unethical experiment is that it's bad science.
You mentioned Martha Stevens from the Cincinnati Hospital. Are you in contact with any of the other victims or people that were involved in these experiments?
So at the time, and my book's been out for a long time, at the time I was, and I moved on to other projects, so I did lose contact with most of these individuals. And when I spoke with Martha Stevens last spring, I asked her if she was in touch with any of the people or families involved in these experiments, and she was not. And I think a lot of these people have died, but their records, for anyone who's interested, are still available, as best I recall, at the University of Cincinnati.
To you, what would you say would have been probably the most shocking or most disturbing of, aspect of any of the experiments or the experiment itself? That just, because all of these are really just unbelievable. But what's something that just really, even to this day, that still sticks out to you?
I have to say Cincinnati, because if you look at, well, let me back up. In terms of horror, I would have to say the Cincinnati experiment might have been the most horrific, because when you read these medical records, and when you read the medical records in Cincinnati, they talk about these people dying in 27 days. Within a day or two after they were given or exposed to these massive doses of whole body radiation, they began vomiting and, developed uncontrollable diarrhea. Their blood counts went to 0. They developed sepsis and they died. So that was horrific in terms of the brutality of that experiment and how quickly the radiation effects manifested. In the case of the plutonium experiment, they were injected with smaller doses, and it took a longer time for the effects of the radiation to be felt. I will say that, and I know that you've talked to Eileen Allen, I will say that the case of her father was incredibly horrific. Of all the 18 people, Eileen Allen, for your audience who may not know her, lived and still lives in Italy, Texas, and she's a retired school teacher. And her father was one of the 18 people injected with plutonium during the Manhattan Project. But his case was really unique because he was a railroad porter, and he had injured his knee when a train jolted, and he fell. And he ended up in the hospital at the University of California, San Francisco Hospital, and they diagnosed him with having a bone cancer. Now, he was an adult. He had children of his own. This form of bone cancer usually affects only children, and there was no history of this form of cancer in their family. Well, they decided he had this cancer, and this fast-growing bone cancer. And so they injected him in the calf with plutonium. And 3 days later, they amputated his left leg and high thigh, allegedly for this bone cancer, which I have grave doubts that he ever had. So the doctors, scientists at UCSF made him an amputee for the rest of his life. This was horrific.
It really was. And, for the audience, like Eileen mentioned, there's an episode here that I did late last year with Elmerine. It's about her father, Elmer Allen. And she goes into detail about what happened and his life and the experiment itself. And the details are just so shocking and surprising. And Mr. Allen's story sticks with me most out of all the other experiments I've come to learn about. his story sticks with me the most, mainly because he knew something happened. He just didn't know what. He knew that he was injected with something. He could feel it, and he was trying to tell people. And no one believed him. He lived for 40 years after that experiment happened. And he spent all of that time trying to tell people, hey, something happened. And no one believed him. And it wasn't until, a year after he passed that it all came out.
Right.
And
exactly.
That's a horrible feeling for anyone. I mean, you look at victims of any sort of crime, they'll tell you, when you try to tell people that something happened and they don't believe you, it's another kind of pain. It adds insult to injury, because you're screaming into the void and you're saying, hey, I need help. And people are ignoring you when they really don't have a reason to. And I understand, but at the same time, it's with a loved one, you always take their concerns seriously. And then when you find out, once you investigate it and look into it, look a little closer, and you see, oh, okay, well, there's nothing to be concerned about, or there is something to be concerned about. You look at this person, you look at a change in their behavior, and you have to say, what's causing this? It's not the typical excuse for things like that is like they did with him is, oh, he's gone crazy. And I think he started drinking alcohol a little bit more after this happened. So they just kind of said, okay, well, it's got to be that. Not thinking, well, what would cause him, if he never drank like this, what would cause him to start? What would cause him to increase that? It's just the whole thing. It really sticks with me. My heart breaks for him. But I would encourage people to go and listen to that, in addition to getting Eileen's book, because it is an important work that should be read in order for us to stop this type of thing from happening again, because it has happened again. It is happening again. And that kind of leads me to another question. What are some things that you think, Eileen, that, could have been done to help these people sooner, other than having because sometimes there were, you had journalists like yourself who broke the stories, but then you had certain people who were whistleblowers who may have kind of tipped someone anonymously. But what are some things that you think could have been done differently to help these people get justice a lot sooner?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the first thing is acknowledgement of what they're saying, and confirmation that what they're saying happened, did in fact happen. So the first thing is acknowledgement of the facts and apology. Yes, we did this to you. Yes, this happened. Yes, it was wrong, and we're sorry. And of course, I think the second thing is compensation for pain and suffering that occurred. Acknowledgement of their suffering, acknowledgement of their truth about what happened, apology, and I think a compensation for the pain and suffering. I mean, nothing can compensate for the damages or deaths, but it's symbolic of what happened. And I go back to the Trinity victims who were really the first, or some of the first victims of the nuclear age, and they're still fighting for monetary damages and recognition of what happened.
I know I see the movement for the downwinders, people who, for the audience, when they did these atomic blasts, one of the things they didn't take into account was how far that radiation would travel. People who were downwind of that, and it landed on their land and their water, their animals, on them and their homes, and a lot of people were affected. And these people to this day are still fighting to be acknowledged, to be compensated. They're still fighting that fight.
And I will say too, for your audience, will the Trinity victims, if you will, I don't like to use that word necessarily, but they do have a website called the Tularosa Basin Downwinders, and a lot of their stories are on that website, and people can read about what they saw on that day in July 1945.
Okay. I'll be sure to include a link to that so people can go check that out. Yeah, because that's something important that people definitely need to know about and see what's happening there. How can we buy the Plutonium Files, your book?
You can buy it from Amazon. It's an ebook, softback, hardback format, and so you can buy it through Amazon, or you can go to Friesen Press, which published the book, and that's FRIESEN, and you can buy it through them. They're in Canada. So just Google the title, Plutonium Files, and it'll take you to sites where you can buy the book.
And for you guys, I hope you know that, like I mentioned before, Eileen, she won a Pulitzer Prize for this. Okay, this is a big deal. This is a major book. Okay, they don't give the Pulitzer Prize out to just anybody, and she won it for this book, for her work and her journalism, which she worked really, really hard on this and put names and faces to the victims so that they're not lost to, they're not lost to time and history and people trying to cover it up. So I strongly recommend this book. You're a teacher or an educator, share these types of things with your class, your students, because this is American history and it's something that should be known. We want to celebrate the good all the time and look at our heroes, but we also need to look at the bad side. And I think people tend to get a little uptight when you talk about those things, kind of like slavery. They want you to just forget about it and get over it. But those things have an effect on families. These were human beings. These were people. And these people had children. They had husbands and wives and parents and friends who loved them. And their lives were interrupted by someone else's greed. And to top it off, these people have gotten away with it. There have been no convictions. These people were not arrested. They were not charged with crimes, which is what they were, crimes. And nothing happened to them. And that gives them room to keep doing it. My last episode, I did a series. I did a three-part series on an article written by L. Song Richardson called When Human Experimentation is Criminal. And it basically dives into the legal consequences or lack thereof of these types of experiments. And I explore that in 3 different episodes. I read through the article and, give my own commentary. So hopefully you guys will go and read up on that. But it's something that we definitely have to take into consideration and look into ending this practice, because if you don't punish them, they'll just keep doing it. They'll keep doing it, and they'll keep bypassing what they should be doing, because there are rules in place for this. But we got to get tougher with these scientists and these research projects.
Yes, well, I agree with everything you said regarding this experimentation and the fact that many of these experiments were crimes and the perpetrators never had to face justice, in part because a lot of them were already dead. So they got away with it, and so did their institutions. And they should be held accountable. So I totally agree with all of that. And I'm not touting my book, but I will say that in republishing the book, I had an opportunity to look at some of the research that I had to look at the time, and so the book contains footnotes to a lot of really rare documents that aren't available online, that you would have to go to archives to get. And that's why I don't recommend it, because it's my book. I recommend that people get the book and then use those footnotes to do their own explorations. As I mentioned, a lot of this stuff is available and readable in archives, but people have to get there in person. I gave all my records to the University of Colorado in Boulder, and a lot of them are online. Some of the medical records of the patients they removed for privacy reasons, and I need to get back with them and ask them to put that back in the public domain, because that was really the purpose of putting my records up there, so that when I was no longer around, people could still go up there and read about Elmer Allen, read about the day he got the injection, and as well as other individuals. So, yeah, I agree with everything you say, and I really appreciate being on your program, and I appreciate all your listeners, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Is there a way that people can contact you if they have more questions, like, your email or even your social media accounts?
They can contact me by email at my email address, which is my name, Eileen, EILEEN, Welsome, WELSOME, at me.com, mobilemE.com. And I will say, I will certainly answer those emails. Because I'm not a working journalist right now, it's hard for me to investigate a lot of cases, but I can make suggestions as to where people might go or how they might go about investigating their own case.
Before we end this, I do want to ask about one more experiment. With the U.S. military, because most of the time these experiments that we hear about were done on civilians, private citizens, just your average, everyday people. But what about military personnel? Do you have any experiments that were done, or radiation experiments that were done on soldiers?
Soldiers, there were thousands of soldiers who were exposed to radioactive materials when they had the detonation at the atomic at the Nevada test site starting in 1951. And so soldiers were marched to ground zero soon after the explosions, and they were exposed to radioactive dust, radioactive debris. They had pilots. They were called sampler pilots, and they flew through mushroom clouds, and they had canisters on their wings, and these canisters collected the radioactive debris from these atomic detonations. So, and in the Pacific, many sailors were exposed to radiation when they had the gigantic tests in the Pacific. So, in the years after these detonations occurred, a lot of these soldiers developed various illnesses that they attributed to their radioactive exposures, and they were known as atomic veterans. And, they repeatedly went to Congress to try to get compensation, and eventually they did get some compensation, but it was really minimal, and it was a long, hard fight. And so, in general, all of these soldiers believed that they were guinea pigs during the nuclear era, that they were used as guinea pigs.
That's just as bad as doing it to civilians. Except with soldiers, I don't want to say I don't want to say it's expected, but, that's kind of a risk that you run with being part of the military, is that exposure, to things that you don't really fully understand, whereas your average person, they wouldn't come in contact with such things.
I think that's true, but I also think that the soldiers were never told that they were going to be exposed to this potentially dangerous material. And I think that the military, their superiors needed to inform them. And I think when they enlist in one of these services, whether it's the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, I don't think that they should be unnecessarily subjected to various products without their informed consent. And they never gave their informed consent. In fact, they were told that this radioactive debris, the radioactive dust that they inhaled, was safe, that it was harmless. So they were lied to as well as the civilians.
Right. I agree. All right. So, Eileen, thank you so much for being a guest again. I'm a lucky man to have you on here twice. So I feel like I might be doing something right, but I really do appreciate it because, you've given a lot of knowledge, and the feedback I've gotten from the first episode was really good because you give us a lot of information and you give it so eloquently, and you make sure that we understand it, and you speak it in a way that we understand it. So I definitely appreciate you sharing your time and sharing your knowledge, and definitely for republishing your book and putting it back out there. And once again, remind people where they can get the book.
Okay. And I want to thank you again for your interest and your time, and for your listeners' time. And if they want to look into this further, the book is available at Plutonium Files, and it's available on Amazon or available through Friesen Press, which republished the book. But I would just say, just Google it, and you'll find your way to it. The cheapest is the ebook, and then you can skim it. There's photographs, as I mentioned earlier. There's I think I have 1,500 to 2,000 footnotes in the back of the book. I mean, the back, they call it back matter in a book.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really difficult to put in the second time around. And I just didn't want to do it because it was really a lot of material. But my husband said, no, that's part of the book, so that people can really delve into whatever they want. So I will say that in the book, if there's a quote in the book attributed to an individual, all they have to do is, they say, well, where did Eileen get that quote from? All they have to do is go to that quote and go to the page number, turn to the back of the book, and it shows the source of the quote. And many times it was an interview that I did. Sometimes it was from another book, sometimes it was from a scientific report, a government document, but everything is there. This is not science fiction. I mean, it's nonfiction, it's real, it's not misinformation or disinformation, it's the truth. And that's why I put those 1,500 footnotes in the back of the book.
Well, it's that attention to detail that is important. And it kind of coincides with the name of this podcast, Devil in the Detail. And the devil is really in the details. You really have to, a lot of times, dig in and look at certain aspects that you probably wouldn't normally consider, because an overview doesn't do it really any justice. That's like me, even this interview, while it's good, it doesn't do the book any justice. You have to read it. And I would recommend that the people get an ebook and a hard copy of the book. I'd recommend both. Myself, I prefer hard copies of books. I'll take an ebook if I can't get anything else, but I prefer a hard copy because it's just something about being able to turn pages, and I just love the feel of it.
I think I'm in agreement with you.
Mm-hmm.
I like to have a book in my hands as well. And the thing about this book, because it is so big, and it's intimidating to look at, but you can take this book and, like I said, you can delve into one area and just focus on that, and then go look at the footnotes. But you don't have to take the whole book. You can take it piecemeal. Find out whatever you're interested in and follow it through the book and through those footnotes. And then do your own research in these archives, many of which are online now. So, like you said, the devil is in the details.
Exactly. Well, Eileen, once again, thank you so much for being here. And hopefully, if I can do a third time, I will definitely give you a call, and hopefully you'll be available.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Well, this concludes today's episode of the Devil in the Details podcast. Again, let's thank our special guest, Miss Eileen Welsome, for joining us again on the podcast. Be sure to stay tuned for upcoming episodes. I have a couple of guests that I have lined up that I'd like to interview. Hopefully I get them. I'm trying my best. If I do, these will be phenomenal episodes, I'm sure. Please share this episode and the podcast with your family and friends. You can find it on Spotify as well as YouTube. Join my social media pages. You'll find me at TikTok at Devil in the Details Podcast, on Twitter at Will to Live US, and Instagram at Will to Live US. Also, be sure to please sign the petitions that I have on change.org as well as Color of Change. You will find all of these in my link tree, which is linked below in the description. You'll find all the links that I just mentioned there for my social media, the podcast. You'll find articles and other things listed there as well. So please check that out. Share that with family and friends on your social media pages as well. And again, stay tuned for upcoming episodes. And again, that's all. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care. Peace.